Thank you. Thank you and welcome. Yep, welcome. Come on in. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the fourth time that we present the International Student Competition Drawing of the Year. This year we have received 365 drawings for the competition, and it comes from 64 countries. It's more than 150 more drawings than we have from the previous years. And it's from almost twice as many nations that before. So I find it very impressive, and we must say it's a success. The theme this year, as you probably know, we have a new theme every year. This year is Habitation. How do we live around the world? The other years have been, the first year was our motto, engaging through architecture, and then transformation, and last year, sustainability, and this year, of course, habitation. And this year, Drawing of the Year focus exclusively on the sketches and drawings created using digital technology. First year we start with hand drawings, and this year digital technology. The international jury, as you know, we have an international jury every year, and this year consists of architect and curator Eva Frankie Shelbert from the United States. She's here today and will present a lecture for us. Eva is from New York and is a New York-based architect, curator, educator, and lecturer of experimental forms of art and architectural practice. And since 2010, she has been chief curator and executive director of Storefront for art and architecture in New York. You probably know Storefront. The second jury member is the architect Sergey Shubon. He's from Germany, and he is a Moscow and Berlin-based architect. And in 2009, he was the founder of Shubon Foundation and the Museum of Architectural Drawing in Berlin. The third jury member is also here today, is Kasper Heiberg Fransen from Denmark, and Kasper is associate partner from Schmidt Hammer Lassen Architects. And the last jury member is myself, Dean here at Aarhus School of Architecture. I would like to thank our sponsors. Two of them is here today, Vola, the Danish company Vola, and Schmidt Hammer Lassen Architects, and the Danish Art Foundation is also a sponsor. Thank you for once again sponsor this event. I would also like to thank our curator Karen Kjærgaard, the associate professor Anne Mette Boye, and our vice dean Trine Berthold, and of course our student assistants for your great effort in organizing and creating the exhibition you will see next door in 20, 30, 40 minutes. But before we reveal the winners, because that's why we're here, find the winners, we will be presented of a short video from Sergey has sent us. He couldn't be here today. And of course, as I announced, a lecture by Eva. And Eva will also present and announce the winners. So to you that have been able to come, welcome. And I will switch to the video by Sergey.
So, first of all, I'm very, very glad that I could take part on this competition jury, and I'm so sorry not to be here today, because of course I would be very, very glad to give personally the prize to one of participants. But I would like to express my feeling about architectural drawings. For me, a drawing is a way of thinking. And I think every architect should think about what kind of architecture he likes to do, what kind of architecture he finds nice or conceptual, interesting. And this way to understand these things is, from my personal view, the best way through the drawing. That's why, for me, the drawing not only a part of art solution, but is a very important part of thinking, a very important part of creativity of architect. So far, the prize we give today is the prize for creativity, for the possibility to express own thinking through the lines, through the drawing, what I think is very, very important for our occupation.
And Eva, the stage is yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation and your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. That's a lot of information for you guys right now. Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much for kidnapping me for some days to discover the city of Aarhus and to enter into a tradition that I think is an incredible tradition. I'm here as the director of Storefront for Art and Architecture, but to talk about drawings. And drawing is something that, as an architect and as a professor, but also as a curator, I have tried to elevate within the cultural status that we carry. Drawings within architecture have always played a role of communication, sometimes of real professional practice, meaning drawings are those tools that allow us to communicate with contractors, with builders, and yet we do know that ideas do start with a drawing. And if in the world of art the drawing has the status of work of art, we hardly have managed to achieve that status through architecture drawings. Sergey, who is not here, with his museum, is definitely trying to do that. And so how, from an institution like a Storefront that tries to push the limits and the boundaries of what we consider disciplinary inquiry or what we consider architecture, how do we do that? I am going to try to make connections around different roles of architects. And I'm going to trailblaze probably around 30 minutes through a lot of different things. And I will try to make sense from this image of a tradition of architecture practice that seems pretty old and old-fashioned, but yet it's pretty real, in relationship to this, that is three students making a statement about drawing, meaning going as line weights. As many of you might know, line weights, they don't play such an important role as they used to be, although yesterday night we kept on talking about line weights. And I will tell you in which context this image makes actually sense. But I would like to start with my favorite drawing. And why do I think that this is an incredible drawing? And I'm not going to try to make an academic discourse about from diagrams to images to maps to plans to drawings, but to start with this illustration of a particular moment in time. Drawing always carries within itself a very clear political understanding of its historical moment. This map from the 17th century of Paris has many layers, and I'm just going to go very briefly about it, because what for me is very interesting is how, if the architect is probably the only individual within society that has the responsibility and the obligation to articulate the social, the political, the economic conditions and materialize them through built form, how is that expressed and materialized through drawings? In this drawing, we don't only find the form of the city and the different resources and the different elements that gives us orientation into this space, but in this planned town perspective where we have the horizon and the royal elements that distinguish the power, in the top what we find is the queen, the king and the queen, as in this hierarchy of power in the highest, most elevated plan of the drawing, followed by the aristocracy, the ones that actually have the axis of the city, the ones that circulate, and the ones that in fact are not occupying the horizon and that space of the sun given only to the kings, but actually the space of the city. In the third level, we have the merchants and the ones who actually are able to go through the smaller roads but still constitute that mass of the city. And in the bottom, already in the countryside, in the explanation of things, almost already outside of the walls of the city, we find the peasants, that lower class that keeps the city alive. How this drawing is at the same time a depiction of a city, a depiction of a social structure, a depiction of an economic edifice, is something that to me is fascinating, apart from many other things. We could spend more than half an hour just talking about this. But instead of that, I'm going to go and try to talk about what happens. Can we put the volume a bit down? Yeah, thank you. What happens when the architect starts looking into the world that we are living outside, that we are building, and yet not only see form, not only seeing it through this small hole that sometimes architectural discipline is, but try to start rendering and making visible more of the forces that in fact constitute this world that we live in. The idea that representation historically has been extremely based with ocular centrism, with things that remain and belong to the realm of the visible, is something that we have started to really move away from questions of atmosphere, or phenomenology, or politics. Drawings have moved from the representational to the indexical to the performative in so many different layers. I'm much more interested in planets that do not look just like an image, but that look into the relationships about individuals, histories, narratives, and politics. So let's make a small jump, and let's go back. How many of you know about the Storefront for Art and Architecture? Few, but not everyone, right? So what does a storefront do? Storefront does 5 things. We do exhibitions, competitions, publications, projects, and ultimately we do, in a certain way, what no one else likes to do, that is to produce agitation within an architectural discourse. This institution started in 1982 as a group of people who were totally disenchanted with what was happening inside the schools, inside the cultural institutions, and inside the status quo. And they decided to produce a space where they could meet artists, architects, philosophers to discuss what was that we could do in order to understand and shape the built environment. From that small space that no one probably knows, it moved into a very small triangular sliver in New York City that many have visited, not in this form as it was from 1982 to 1994, but actually as this building, as this iconic installation designed by Stephen Hall and Vito Acconci in 1994 that was built to be just temporary for 6 months, and it was built without a building permit. Sometimes it's a bit challenging to say, just do it. Just take the risk. And who is willing to take the risk in a time in which we are so well behaved, in which we want to get a degree, in which we want to become the top of the field in our game? We want to break as little rules as possible. And yet what is interesting is that this building, 25 years later almost, is still there. And it is still a manifesto of what this institution is about, producing a blurring between the inside and the outside of the institutional space and the space of the street. So while the facade is that iconic moment, this plan, what happens at the Storefront, is what, for me, is the most interesting. How does one agitate and produce architectural discourse, and not only through a kind of social movement addressing important issues like homelessness or queer space, but also looking into aesthetic forms of representation. Storefront was one of the only places in New York City that tried to understand how the Occupy movement could take space of design. And we ask architects to articulate forms of communication between the established structures of power and citizens. And yet, still, it's a space for spatial experimentation, for performances, for all kinds of different forms of dealing with the space, technology, architecture, art, and any discipline that is interested in contributing into the redefinition of the power structures that we have at play. Because I think we would all agree that the world as we have it, although as we dreamed that was a perfect one, it is not. And I think we would probably all agree that the ethical grounds, we are all sharing the same, and yet the structures that they take, they are not. And so from installations or projects like this one that just simply try to redefine what a wall can be and how one actually thinks of architecture not just as not just simply as something that is to be designed and touched, but as something that is to be problematized and questioned. Installations at the Storefront, can we put the volume a bit up? This is an installation by Lucy McGray and Skylar Tibbetts, that what it did was to look into simply walls that can embrace us, walls that can touch us, walls that can actually breathe with us. In a world in which your digital self is more emotionally loaded than our physical one, how do we actually feel? And if we are handicapped, how do we actually allow ourselves to be moved by the architecture that surrounds us? So I guess the sound cannot come up anymore, but I will try. So, not because it's any interesting, but it gets us into a mood. And moods are also important. How do we draw a mood? How do we represent a mood? What was interesting about this project is that the only way to represent it was to actually make this video. The installation was, in fact, extremely hard to perceive in the space. If we would make a drawing, we would not be able to perceive it. But the video was the medium by which it came alive. But here we are to talk about drawings. And what is that drawings can do for us? This was a project that we started back in 2014, in which many of the individuals in New York City work for large architecture firms, drawing toilets probably every single day, drawing details, and using AutoCAD or Vectorworks or whatever software they use in a daily basis without little space for creative action. This instant drawing was an exercise in which we invited people to come and sit by the sidewalk and start drawing directly into the buildings across from the street, as a way in 3 minutes to produce this instant drawing that would transform the way in which we relate to a particular software. But this kind of events is part of this space of redefinition and of agitation that we like to produce within this organization. And the tradition of drawing, the tradition of imagination in architecture is something that it's a long-standing tradition. And I think this competition speaks to the spirit of that. In this space of experimentation and this space of producing different ways of asking questions, Storefront has organized competition throughout its 25 years of history that probably no one else wanted to ask. How do we reconstitute the symbols in our currency? We all have seen those things happening in the recent years, particularly also in this country. But how do we actually redesign? This was a competition run in 2008, the White House, the house of the most powerful, or in this case, crazy man, if we speak about today, on planet Earth. And so competitions that try to push the boundaries of that, what we sometimes as architects take as our responsibility. This competition that we are running, in fact, every 3 years is the competition of competitions. And it is a competition that asks each one of us, what is the brief that you would like to receive as an architect? Sometimes we wait for mayors, for presidents, for politicians, for developers to tell us a museum, and we all go crazy to design a museum in Helsinki for a kind of Starbucks museum quality-like, and we are like, is this really what the year 2015 or 14 should be about? Probably not, right? So the questions here is, what are the questions that our society demands? And it is our responsibility to ask them. So this competition, I invite you to look for it when it comes out, and the winner actually is a competition that we do run. The winner of 2 years ago was Inca, and they asked what buildings should we think about demolishing, in fact. And as a concept, and also as a concept in terms of representation, and I believe that many of you probably do know that architecture now is engaging as well with that space of erasure. And in a world that is highly constructed every time more, I think this becomes even more relevant. So to finish this kind of like radiography of what Storefront does, we like to do projects, exhibitions, events, publications, competitions, and the projects they take outside the world as its field, and trying to understand that the gallery, this triangular space, is more than just a space in which one enters, but is a space that, and an attitude that actually goes outside. So this project, commissioned to Jimenez Lai and Grayson Cox, is a kind of physical space that allows to transform and to produce these new forms of engagement and discussion and conversation that takes into public space the spirit of the organization. And so, let's move finally to drawings. 5 years ago, when I moved from the pedagogical space to the institutional space of Storefront for Art and Architecture, I still thought that we don't talk enough about drawings. And not only in the academic level, but in the professional level. So we started a tradition that was, I didn't know at the time, but we did it for 3 years, so, and now we call it the Trilogy drawing series, in which we ask 30 architects every year to make a drawing. But to make a drawing that would be exhibited inside the storefront, but of a storefront. As a way that when you would enter the space, what you would see is a drawing of the space in which you are observing, and you would be able to see 30 different minds and 30 different ways of understanding the space. As a student, that's always very simple, when they make you draw a bench and you see the bench of everyone, and that's easy. But when suddenly you have Bernard Tschumi or Stephen Hall next to one of your younger colleagues, and you're able to measure yourself against some of those figures that you have admired and revered, suddenly something there happens. But how does one provoke? And so aesthetics is something that we may be able to talk about in abstract terms, and yet what happens sometimes in architecture representation, and lately more than ever, is that there is an anesthetic. How many of you uses birds in your renderings? You don't have to raise your hands, right? So, and balloons, and children, and smiley faces, and green, and comics, and axonometrics, and what are all those things doing for us? So the question here is, what are the things that we are inserting into an architectural rendering that absolutely have nothing to do with architecture? So this exhibition of aesthetics and aesthetics on birds, clouds, children, axonometrics, and comics, what we did is to actually mine the entire internet of images and renderings and remove from those renderings the children, the clouds, the birds, the green, all those cosmetic elements, to see what was left, and to see if that architecture had actually any value. Because you can have amazing scalies and amazing clouds and amazing birds, and you might convince a client. But let's talk about architecture, and let's talk how architecture, in fact, actually really produces ideas. And I'm talking as well to the guys and girls that, in fact, use axonometrics because they want to be the intellectual ones, and they don't use any of those things, but they are the intellectuals, and they use axonometrics also as an aesthetic device. So we need to be extremely careful and to really be paying attention about what that is. So that was the first year. The second year, the theme was pop. Protocols. Architecture always deals with protocols, but also with obsessions. Each one of us has obsessions about particular things, forms, ways of understanding the world. But an obsession without a position has absolutely no value. How that obsession responds and resonates with the things that the world is able to understand and has historically understood. Every single obsession needs to have a position, and you need to be able to identify that. So the third theme, the third year, the theme was measure. We are constantly being asked to quantify what we do. How many people come to your gallery? How many students did apply? How many people submitted for this competition? How many countries? How many likes did you get in that image? How many? And you're like, wait, does it really matter if my image has 100,000 likes or 3? Does it matter that this auditorium is full or that it's only half full? Depends who is in there, right? I could be talking to 500 million people and really not touch one mind, or be talking maybe to people who cannot understand or enact some of those ideas. But I always feel I'm in the right room, regardless of how many people are there. And so the idea of measure is something that is extremely problematic because architecture constantly deals with measures. And yet we do know that the best architecture hardly can be quantified. So we did ask, again, 30 other architects to draw a storefront with the idea of measure in hand. So what we got is drawings like this. And you would think, this was part of the measure one. Well, no, this was in the first show, right? And it is interesting to see them all together, but this is storefront has the same dimension as the balcony. The balcony is on the tram tower or a subway car or the base of the Statue of Liberty. And it's fascinating to see how such a small institution compares spatially to other spaces that we might have a total different reference, or how one can take the 30 years of storefront exhibitions and projects and produce an entire building that is much bigger than those 900 square feet that, in fact, the gallery has. Or thinking that the storefront is, in fact, just this sliver of sky that opens as a curtain of a performing act that this sliver of a space in New York does into this sky that we call architecture or the discipline. Or how a storefront, through its facade and through its game, could be just a simple hole in this field of geometries that if we would think that is not only a facade but could be in the horizontal ground, would open an entire new idea of urbanism, and how these elements actually overlap within each other. And so each one of these drawings, this one by Jürgen Meyer, give us very particular understandings of the power of drawing. I was fascinated with this drawing. This drawing is a perspective drawn with the sign, the indexical sign of the isolation form, right? When we draw in plan the foam element. And this was an installation that he did back in the 1980s because he foamed the entire corner of a storefront. And so collapsing this space of plan representation and indexicality with a perspectival element is something that as an architect, it gave me pleasure. And so sometimes there are these moments of simply trying to go beyond that what we know. This is Bernard Tschumy's fragments. It's not the Manhattan transcripts, but it is the storefront transcripts, and how he actually deconstructs through each one of those holes and fragments a story of porosity and so on. How Jimenez Lai looks through each one of the panels and looks into the different events and formats and exhibitions, but also explores about the basement that used to be the office of a storefront, and obviously that looks like something like myself with a bottle of wine and a disco ball, what all it's true. So the idea of how a drawing can go from the comical, like this one, to the extremely, if you want, journalistic, like this one, that is all kind of different understandings of what different storefronts in New York are and can be, to things that have to do more with the sensorium. This, in the measuring show, this was a drawing that had, in fact, worms living on this partiture that was playing a music that was, in fact, inhabiting the space. The idea that architecture is not only measuring itself against the world, but also against itself. As this drawing by Victor Enric, in which a storefront transformed into a billboard of architecture and a symbol of freedom and expression, is standing on top of Joseph Louis Serre building for the World Fair exhibition in Paris, where the Guernica was in fact exhibited. So the way in which drawings like this one by Razor and Umemoto is using paint that is sensible to the humidity and the temperature and is able to change and to give you an understanding of the space, literally through its representation, are things that are not new to us. But it is an incredible journey to go through drawings and drawings and drawings. And I could probably go through the 90, and don't worry, I'm not going to do that. But this drawing by Perry Colper, when I received it, I mean, it's incredible. It's an incredible pleasure to be there, sitting by the office and getting one drawing and then another one. And so this dragon that is Manhattan, right, being eaten by this larger dragon, it has a location that is the eye of the dragon, that is in fact a storefront, that is a zoom in between Broadway, Kenmore, and Lafayette. And in this zoom, it is where suddenly we are able to find the plan with its openings, with suddenly each one of the different degrees of radius of opening and the different surfaces and puzzles that can be constructed through this building. And so how does one look into this drawing and how does one take it into another space or into another generative space is something that I don't necessarily know. Sometimes some projects produce speculative thinking. If Hong Kong would be New York, storefront would be Hong Kong, New York. And yet sometimes drawings appear as something like this. This was Jorge Otero Pailo, someone who works on preservation, in a very interesting way of thinking about preservation. I don't know if you start seeing something here, but Storefront's facade is an extremely porous space. This is a photography of the pollution in the facade, where an S from a past exhibition vinyl was being able to be extracted. So drawings sometimes are just traces of a world past. A drawing sometimes is just a way of looking and of thinking. Sometimes are metaphoric, sometimes are performative. Andrew Zago draws storefront like a ship. Storefront is always this very small triangle where individuals, they actually join into a journey that carries an edifice of buildings and tradition that is somehow always a bit behind it, but just above it. And this is how we like to think. We are also not really touching that boat that is moving. It's not that we move with progress. Sometimes we move against the current. We are a boat that maybe on top of this boat we are about to fall off. And it is in this fragility of being hovering, not touching the ground, and yet at the same time always thinking that we are moving forward, that the storefront exists. This drawing by Shohei Shigematsu from OMA, what it did was to actually render visible something that the storefront is. That is not only this gallery space, but is the gallery space plus the sidewalk. All the openings, in fact, are happening in the street. Or that, in fact, the plaza and the Petrosino Square next to us is also part of the gallery, mostly because we have taken over it. So the idea of how drawing renders property, renders agency, and space anew is simply the power that architecture does have. So from diagrammatic drawings that show power relationships and how individuals throughout the history of a storefront relate to each other, to drawings like this one by Sarah Whiting and Ron Whitty, in which storefront is simply seen as a set of lines in a circle, a vortex that disrupts and allows for things to permeate and to continue and to change this figure into something other. What we have always dreamed of is that a storefront, in fact, is a mirror, is a space by which individuals that are trying to push the boundaries of architecture and the discipline can see themselves reflected into its institutional facade, not in its real concrete facade. And so it is through these drawings that we do exhibitions and where we clad the floor with all these clouds, children, comics, and axonometrics, or where we actually transform the space into a set of colors that would measure if you are colorblind, if you would not be able to see the symmetry between the red and the green spectrum. And so the idea is how installations and the space always operate as a real understanding of how do we think about architecture, but also how do we produce architecture. It's not only about speculative models, it's also about the production of those models. And so what happened after the trilogy of drawings? We started a new tradition, and it is the model show. So this model show started this year, and what we actually did was to really try to understand what is happening in our society these days. We are sharing more than ever. We are sharing cars with Uber pools, we are sharing apartments with Airbnb, we are sharing private life in digital, we are sharing everything. And architecture is always behind those digital disruptions, this economy of sharing, as if we had to give form to something that is already ahead of us. What would happen if suddenly we sit down, we pause, and we start thinking, how is architecture to really take this new cultural paradigm and produce an architecture that redefines what we constitute as public space, the commons, and try to think of an architecture that does that. So I took Manhattan, I sliced it in 30 chunks, it's a highly pleasurable act, and gave each slice to an architect. And I asked them to look into the different assets that the city of Manhattan had that have not been yet capitalized by society, and to produce an exact model of that part of the city, but trying to make a new vision for the city by looking into those elements. Each architect was given a slice. It was not big enough to have them just go into visionary, large-scale interventions. It was not small enough just to concentrate on a building scale. It was this awkward scale in which they had to engage with the buildings, but also with the urban form. So this kind of Frankenstein model came again through all the pieces, almost as a miracle of sorts. And each model was accompanied again through a drawing to also be able to help and understand what things can be and should be represented through a model or through a drawing. And so what was interesting about each one of those propositions is that each one of them carried a radical understanding of the way in which we can think about the city, in which we can think about architecture, but also about model making and representation. And so within this space, I'm just going to show you one slice. That is the one by C2 Studio, slice number 13, next by Central Park in the Upper East Side. If you don't know if you are familiar, but that's where the extremely wealthy people live. And so when one looks into this diagram, what one encounters is a mountain, a topography, that in fact renders visible something that we don't know. And so what this renders visible is the difference between the amount of money that these individuals pay in taxes versus the amount of taxes that they should pay if their property values would be according to real market values. What people do in New York City is that they actually simply put the same value of these apartments, high luxury apartments, as social housing projects or other housing projects. So how architecture through representation is able to make a political statement and to make something visible is something that I do think it is part of our task. And so I'm going to just go through some of these exhibitions that we have done over the last years to show you, like in this one that was about closed worlds and closed systems, in which we try to understand, as in that image in the facade you saw, what's the power of shit. What is that architecture can do in the understanding of energy and closed systems and sustainability? And what kind of systems of representation do we have within our discipline to really understand how do we draw and how do we produce ways of understanding and communicating architecture and energy. So this was an incredible exhibition curated by Lydia Callipoliti, and that produced an incredible set of drawings. And we are now compiling the publication, but the idea was not only about producing those drawings, but also producing new forms of representation. Today I was in an office here in Aarhus, in which people, of course, and probably all of you are experimenting with VR. And what is that architecture, representation, and drawing can do with new technologies? And how do we actually think about, can we do something there that we could not do by just making a rendering, volume up? And so what is interesting about this video is that you could use with your point layer the ability to actually activate the curiosity of this archive. And so when you would look into each one of these projects while you were walking inside the gallery, yeah, you can lower the volume now. What was interesting about being in this space is that today when I put the VR in this office, they said, but don't move, you will feel the urge to move, but don't move. And I was like, I know. So we created an entire track system that allowed us to move and to engage with the physical, the digital, and the representational in one single space. And so this is probably one of the things that architecture also needs to explore, and drawing needs to explore. So I'm trying to figure out, how are you guys going to do next year, right? What is next year's show or competition going to be? Maybe it is only a show about VR. It's not only digital, maybe it's VR, purely and purely. And so how do we think about architecture, representation, and the world that is ahead of us? So moving into probably the end of this presentation, I wanted to bring some other elements that are less architecture-based, if you want, but extremely important in architectural terms. Letters to the Mayor was a project that we started. How many of you like politics? Yeah, more or less the same ones that know about the storefront. No, I'm kidding. It's so strange because I think we all, myself, kept always a hand away from politics and politicians, and yet they are regulating our lives, and they have a lot to do with what we do. And it is true that great cities happen because great architects are always next to the decision makers. So we started in New York City when de Blasio was elected, a project that was called Letters to the Mayor. And we invited 50 architects to write a letter to the mayor, Bill de Blasio. These letters, in fact, took the form sometimes of drawings, of words, but what was the most fascinating about all of it is that it forced each one of the architects to speak on behalf of everyone, and not only on behalf of themselves. It allowed them to actually become more generous, and that is something that I think we all need to do more often. And so what was interesting about this project is that now it has traveled to many cities. And so this idea that writing a letter is also a way of drawing and a way of expressing power, the project has gone to Kiev, where they had an amazing design of the exhibition, almost as a torture machine for the mayor, to Buenos Aires, to Mexico City, to Taipei, where the mayor came to pick up the letters and was extremely pleased, or to Madrid, where the mayor and the US ambassador and everyone showed up, and even the mayor decided to respond to each one of the architects one by one. And so the question here is, how do we understand the relationship of architecture and politics, and how do we communicate those ideas further? How much more time do I have? Not much. So I'm going to finish with this, mostly because it ends with two nice drawings. as an architecture curator, I do curate some exhibitions, like this one, that tries to look into the future. That is probably what we are all concerned in here, but also into the past, and to understand how architecture has produced an incredible wealth of incredible ideas. Past, futures, present, futures, what it did was it looked into 101 projects that were never built in the city of New York, and reenacted them and brought them into the present, and asked 100 architects around the world to produce an alternative vision that would allow some of those ideas that were still valid to exist in a future sense. And so people came to the gallery thinking they would encounter 101 visionary ideas. You can see them already, things hanging, falling, Buckminster Fuller, Dome over Manhattan, all of that. And yet the truth is that when people would arrive, what they would encounter was this. Series of curtains with mirrors in which your gaze was actually returning you your gaze, looking for those visionary ideas or those amazing images. And the idea of like consumption of ideas and consumption of images is something that I think we need to face. So how do I delay that idea of encounter with you and that image of a future that you're looking? It was something that I like to make people suffer. I know you're just waiting to know who is the winner, so I'm making my lecture extremely long. And so this is very similar, right? This, in fact, what it does, it produced these contextual sheets in which, for each project, it gave a context of random facts of a Western culture in the world, what neologisms existed, what obsolete terms became obsolete that year, and then at the end, it said, we invite you to imagine what architecture should be produced within this context. You're like, seriously? Are you kidding me? And if you want to know what past future projects were produced in this context, please scan this QR code with your mobile device. Who scans QR codes? I mean, no one, right? So it's this degree of frustration, like you have it there, but you're too lazy because you really want to consume it fast. And so the idea here that all these strips were actually trying to delay you the gratification from that project and try to force you to understand that that image was in fact a response to a social, political, economic context that we all sometimes forget. And so when I ask about what is this school about yesterday to your dean and to some of your professors and colleagues, someone said, you know, one could say that in fact it is a lot about context and really are trying to understand what are the forces that make architecture be in a particular moment in time and in space. And so from all these past projects to all the reenactments, this exercise and this project took in the exhibition form a very particular space of invisibility, and yet knowing that in fact it is in the image happening in the head of the visitor that this space is actually going to emerge. And so within this space of this location and projection, there is always a space other, that is the space of the book, that is the space of representation where these images that everyone wanted to see and encounter, and how Manhattan disappears by having an entire new garden happening through the East River, or how Manhattan becomes this hyper-dense city of urbanity, taking the Hong Kong model of like corridors and spaces. What we do know is that the book is always there for us. So this is simply an invitation to somehow delay the gratification, know how to wait, know how to stop, and I am going to finish with a fun note and to explain you why that image of those guys with the line weights in their faces, and I realized that Danish people have an amazing sense of humor, more than any other country probably, and so when I look into this image, and you would say, what does this have to do with architecture? Well, it has a lot to do. And yet, so being in the US, I was extremely frustrated with what happened in Halloween. Many of my students would just dress up as sexy nurses or zombies. And I would really regret the amount of time that they would spend making that like kind of bloody mask. And I said, what if we would use that energy to produce something just a bit more interesting, yeah? And so we started a Halloween party, but a critical Halloween party. Isn't Halloween supposed to be about scary stuff? Yeah. And there are scary stuff in architecture. If I would ask you what is the most scary thing that you ever thought or encountered, you would probably start thinking about some buildings, right? Or some ideas or some concepts. So the first year, the theme was, what is the thing that we fear the most? What is the thing that you fear the most? You? Your imagination. That's a good one. It's true. then you have a wild imagination. But what is interesting is that people go sometimes to more terrifying things like oblivion. No one of us wants to be forgotten. No one of us wants to be just there in the history of nothing. And yet, the first year we did the theme of banality. The second year we did the theme of metaphor. Metaphors are scary, mostly when you do a ship look like building because it's in the harbor, right? And then the third year we did the corporate avant-garde, also scary concept, something that we all hear about. Or the fourth year it was about irrelevance, I-relevance, things that become relevant in the digital break and things that lose their relevance. And so at the same time, this year the theme was on luxury. And so the parties, they are real good parties. I mean, we have music and costumes and fun, and yet you have your friend Bjarke dressing up as King Kong taking over the skyline of Manhattan. Yes, well, he actually did. That was way before he did it. And so in a certain way, there is a premonition. Today, I was talking about this costume, actually. And so what is interesting is how this Halloween party becomes a tool to express some ideas. This is Mark Kirchner from Marketizer, the founder, coming as the lasso tool of Photoshop. It's really banal, you know, it's never really truly works. So the question here is, how do we take fun and critical thinking as a way to really push the boundaries of the world that surrounds us and take it with humor and ideas? So don't get me wrong, there is a bibliography, and you need to read to come to this party. And you really need to come with a really badass idea, because that's where you, in fact, are able to push your wit into a space of display. And so every year we have a bibliography that you hopefully will read, and if not, it's almost like a seminar in which the open hand of Le Corbusier will become one of these cheesy metaphors, or the housing bubble, or these two guys that resonate with the first drawing I showed you. Many of you probably already now have your own scalies, right? But these are the guys that we can go and buy in the shop. Aren't they banal? I mean, they are generic, you know? They are the most banal thing. They are just like the typical woman, you know, and the gentleman. And no, we need to figure out new forms of subjectivity, new forms of representing the subject. And so this relates back to the first plan that we shown. And so from these two eyes that told us that banality is in the eye of the beholder, to this the money shot of soil, in which you have the Jeff Koons, obviously, as a kind of the banal shot that will have a Jeff Koons dog, and the green and the sky and the birds, very much invoking what we actually did 2 years before with our drawing show. Critical Halloween is an opportunity for architects to think about things that surround us and things that sometimes we don't question, and to do it through humor and fun. And so line weights have lost their ability to be what they were, in fact. And some of these ideas, you will, in fact, find them in some of the drawings that have been put into this competition in different forms. So for me, it's interesting to see how a Halloween party and a drawing competition and an architectural project and many of the ideas that we do try to push in political form are, in fact, better carried in a way of humor and in the way of a party, if you want. This was last year in October, and how real this has become. So we wish that we could demolish the form of democracy that has been imposed into us. And so this year, and this is, yes, really truly the end, because it's a fun video, I'm going to finish with that, the theme was luxury. Isn't it luxury something we really, really actually love to have? The luxury of time, and sometimes people want to see it pass by in a luxury watch, and yet the truth is that luxury is really scary. Luxury is something that, in fact, abuses from a particular class, and it's based on very, very dubious principles. It really takes form and shape in a very decadent way, from golden toilets to some other questions. We need to seriously think when we do luxury housing, what kind of politics and what kind of materials and what kind of policies do we actually engage with. So this was a Halloween party that just happened. Sorry, you cannot join us. But we tried to produce a space of reflection in which, volume up,
More money than me, and me keep going. Haters getting tired, my money's still growing. moaning.
So the reflection of our own buildings, of our own politics, of our own actions are always going to gaze us back. As architects, we do have the responsibility to understand what kind of worlds we engage with, through drawings, through buildings, or through words. So with this long, short introduction, thank you for that. And I guess I have given the task to make the jury report on behalf of each one of the jurors and the school. And so, as was said before, incredible amount of drawings of incredible breadth and sophistication was presented into us, and it made us think and wonder and question what is the role of drawing in the year 2016. And so I'm not going to delay this anymore, and so I'm going to simply start by the special mentions. But first of all, I just want to congratulate everyone and every single student around the world that decided to participate on this. And I would encourage everyone to do the job that and the responsibility that you as a student also do carry, that is to communicate this to even further colleagues. And in the years, even when you leave the school, to keep on communicating about initiatives like this one. So, special mentions, we have 8. And go without no specific order, following like this. Drawing of the year 2016, special mentions is Hugh Ebdy, University of Dundee, Scotland. This image, in fact, reminded the jury of the 1956 This Is Tomorrow image by Richard Hamilton. Many of you might know that image in which one of the figures holding a popsicle is trying to show a world that is hovering and coming into us. How this image shows us the space of virtual engagement as something that can be as real and as fictional in Earth or in Mars is something that we are all fantasizing about. How those spaces of domesticity are, in fact, something that we still dream of, even in the virtual or in the real space. And how those cities, like Paris, are still outside the window. We found that this image, by its composition, by its perfect use of collage, montage, and different techniques, managed to really produce a seamless transition through different mediums, and it brought definitely this idea of representation, even within the eyes of the onlookers in this image, deserve a special mention. Yes! So the author, if it is in the room, I already recognize his drawing, but this falls close to home. Another mention goes to Anders Kras Agard from the Aarhus School of Architecture in Denmark. This drawing is fascinating, and you will see it when you can get close to it. Its ability to collapse in a single plane the representational quality of the brick, probably one of the oldest tools or elements of architectural materialization, and the digital technologies that were used to produce this image by producing this tessellated image through scanning technologies. What it does, it brings two things simultaneously in the same plane: history and detail, and at the same time resolution of the time that has passed. So how the new technologies are able to register things that we could not just 10 years ago is something that this drawing, looking into this window that in fact has been closed, has been blocked, is opening up an entire new universe that is the technologies that we do have in our hands. So please congratulate dear Anders Kras. Is Anders in the room? Anders? Oh. A third mention goes to Eric Wong from the Bartlett School of Architecture in the UK. We all know about the anxiety of contemporary politics, and yet this drawing that here it's very hard to see has a very high complexity of illustration and elaboration about how this British Empire might be assembling itself or falling apart. This deconstruction of traditional architectural features that are coming and floating away or landing and moving around, almost as a kind of Japanese manga style, through this kind of rice fields evacuation of emergency boats with light poles, is perhaps one of the most complete illustrations of a moment in time that will give sense, probably in some years, about the contemporary time that we are in today. Between these forms of representation and the next one, we start looking into different cultural ways of understanding representation and ideas. Another mention, the fourth mention, goes to Trilogy. Oops, yes. I believe we are streaming this, so maybe some of the winners might be watching this online. The next award goes to Tsuyoshi Kikuchi from Nihon University in Japan. And this drawing, it's again another of these composite figures in which a comic strip is combined with a map reading legend in which 4 different layers of things that are not movable, things that can be moved by hand, things that are alive that can actually be transported, things by which we move through, transforms this kind of perspectival imagery through something that brings a certain idea of domesticity and inhabitation, the theme of this year, into a space of the public space and the public realm. So how this drawing that ultimately, in fact, is a story, is a narrative through a public space, becomes domesticated through this layering of colors and lines over, is something that the jury valued very much. So an applause for this. The next drawing is Shiran Ishahai from Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem, Israel. Is a drawing that, made by hand and as well in digital tools, it depicted a very contemporary condition. This landscape, in fact, of violence and exclusion and political conflict is, as many other things in our daily lives, depicted not through images that are able to give a comprehensive understanding of what is going, but almost everything in our daily lives is consumed through a JPEG, through an image. And this is how the world is captured and then is produced into strips, into continuous lines of stories that are partial and sometimes personal. And maybe the only thing that also continues as a strip are the walls that divide us, and that divide people, and that divide territories. And so, in fact, from this mouth that is telling all these stories, what we actually get within our domestic space is just simply this machine that keeps on printing, either through our cell phone devices or even our printing devices, those images that can be also heard through these online devices. So it is a drawing that depicts, in fact, a digital break, and how this digital universe has been able to striate, almost as Deleuze would say more than 20 years ago, a landscape that was continuous at some point and that now has been more fragmented than ever. So a round of applause for Shiran Ishai. This drawing by Rafael Juanate Garcia from the Universidad da Coruña in Spain is a drawing that many of us probably will feel familiar, and I know that Musk is probably familiar to you, but this idea that we are living in an increasingly densifying planet. How we are going to all live together is always a question that we try to answer. The idea of containers and the idea of efficient accumulation of humans, one on top of each other, is sometimes one of the most feasible solutions. And so how within this almost a personal landscape of merchandise, of goods that travel from one place to the other, one still mourns or desires for that certain idea that we saw in some of the images before of domesticity, of that warm light, in that candor is what this image, almost as a manifesto of this contrast between this domesticity and this frivolous landscape of containers, is able to produce. The image as such, the jury found that was compelling by its hue, coloration, and dramatism. And please send rounds of applause for Raphael. Another mention goes to Yuta Asano from the University of Melbourne in Australia. This drawing, almost as a Piranesian excavation into the world of digital production, it brings us almost inside the world of a motherboard computer in which chipboards and spaces become seemingly interchangeable, where individuals are the only reference into a world that could be upside down and left to right, and where vegetation has become as well part of an architectural device, almost a kind of dystopic ruin of what is this world that we are producing, a world of ideas that sometimes just renders individuals as these impossible figures dancing in the top of a cliff. This drawing somehow demonstrated a high level of detail and technique, and at the same time of enchantment. We kept on looking and looking and looking. And sometimes when we talk about aesthetics and anesthetics, one is unable to necessarily pinpoint what is that a drawing does. And yet, one needs to accept that the uncanny sometimes is also very close to the sublime. And this drawing carries many of those layers that made us think that this was definitely one of the drawings that should be part of this final competition. So, an applause for Yuta Asano. And so the final of the mentions goes to Snezana Zlatkovic from the Faculty of Architecture, University of Belgrade in Serbia. And so, how many of you know what this is? Exactly, sort of. But that's fascinating because this is a glitch, right? This is a digital glitch. And yet, digital glitches are things that have just appeared extremely recently. When you're using particular digital technologies to produce an image or a drawing, and then the system collapses, produces images like this. And so if a glitch has become an image that could have never been produced before the entire exuberance of digital production that in the recent years we have witnessed, a new aesthetic is also emerging with it. Looking into this image, we were equally mesmerized as the one that was previously shown, and yet if the other one has architectural forms really recognizable, here we started to project. Is this a section? Is this a plan? Is this a urban plan? Is this a horizon? What is happening here? But what is true is that suddenly we are in front of a drawing that in the theme of this year, this digital world that we are trying to understand and to master, we are living inside this digital world. We are in fact surrounded by glitches. We probably are just an incredible glitch. And yet what is fascinating about this drawing is that at the same time carries an incredible beauty. So please, let's give an applause to Snezana Zlatkovic. And so now we move into the exciting prizes, not because of anything in particular, just because there is a check attached to them, and that always makes it very, very exciting. But also because the jury had an incredible pleasure of being able to recognize those drawings as incredible forms of dealing with the theme of architecture, representation in habitation, and definitely this space that we're inhabiting that is ultimately is architectural discourse. So moving from the glitch, we move into the third prize that goes to Martin Hermann Andersson from the University of Fine Arts in Berlin. This drawing, it shows us a building that could be anywhere. The modern condition of the ubiquitous tower that could be in Berlin, in New York, Shanghai, probably even in Aarhus. It tells us that, in fact, architecture has entered a realm of total generic form. And yet, this generic form that the modern movement showed us through some different techniques, almost always through this section plane, and some images or films like the ones of Jacques Tati show it to us through the workplace or through other forms of domesticity, here is suddenly rendered through this perspectival image, an isometric that is extremely well composed with this perfect edge, and in which the symmetry of the two corners of this chamfering is giving us a kind of turning corner of the darkness that in fact, the life of these buildings gives us. How do we, as contemporary subjects, accept or not this prison of repetition, of sameness, of accumulation of subjectivities and of spaces is something that, as architects, we need to think. When a developer approaches us with these models of inhabitation, are we going to produce just simply an amazing rendering, or are we going to produce something that allows us to really think and reflect about the lives that we are producing and inviting to live? So the images that these incredible drawing portray in our minds are at the same time dystopic and at the same time real, are nothing revolutionary, but in fact extremely important to remind us of the world that we do produce as architects. So with this, I just want to congratulate this third prize, Martin Herman. Please give him a round of applause. The second prize looks into something that is extremely surprising, and I'm going to give you a second. Michael Minghetti from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, in Switzerland, produced a drawing. Do you see the drawing? Well, not much, right? Not much. So I will tell you here what it says. It says, Housing Project of the Year. And here it shows a little hook. It's made of what? It says, it's metal. Interesting. Then there's a rope. And then, what is this? Oh, it's PVC. Oh, I see, it's a cover. This is a tent. Oh, this is a tent. And here it says, Housing Project of the Year. Interesting, isn't it? We are living in a time where probably the migration crisis is not new, but is the biggest that we have seen throughout our lives and history. We are facing a huge challenge as architects. We do not necessarily know how to respond to the urgency of our times. Architectural drawings, like this one, technical drawings, do not need to be produced to actually put a tent. This drawing that helps transmit knowledge, technical drawings are the ones that we use to pass knowledge from one generation to the next, from the architect to the builder, are not needed for actually revealing and helping refugees. But the truth is that as architects, we became useless over this crisis. And the question is, how can we become useful? And it is not just by reinventing the shelter probably again, but it's about thinking very strongly about that. So this drawing as a manifesto, as a joke, as a reflection, and as a drawing, it allowed us to really think of architecture and students as also advocates of our moment in time. So please, let's give an applause to Michael Minghetti. And so we move into the first prize. And the first prize goes to, yet again, another context that is hovering above our heads. It goes to El Hamdi Firas, National School of Architecture and Urbanism of Tunis in Tunisia. And so this drawing depicts, in a certain way, the desolation and the contemporary monuments, if you want, of tragedy that are being built in many cities around the world. Cities from Aleppo to many other spaces in this world are being destroyed, bombed, and erased into mountains of rubble. Lives, cities, communities are being displaced and actually moved away from that universe that once they inhabited. This drawing of a portrait of an image, of a street, of a fictional street, is again a reminder about the role of architecture in really understanding not only the building of cities, but the rebuilding of them. And not only rebuilding cities as a new project out of scratch, but rebuilding cities from the spaces and the memories and the remains of the people that once lived them. If architecture can do something, is understand memory and history and to be able to pay homage to it. So almost as a manifesto, a despaired one, this drawing that uses techniques almost of archaic forms of representation with carbon, almost as if it was raining with a fog, it still gives us this similar sense of an algorithmic accumulation of elements, as that previous drawing showed us, but takes us into a street, almost a street that has no end, or a street that has no exit. And yet it is a street that we are going as architects. That's the world that we are facing. And we better start getting our tools, our drawings, and our imagination in place. So with this first prize, please give an applause to Hamdi Firas. I think I did my job as a hostess and award winner. I think I could get a job out of this. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. And, first of all, Viva, thank you for the lecture. It was fun, it was serious, and it was interesting. And the announcement of all the winners was almost as a lecture too. So thank you, and you're all welcome to go in and see the exhibition. We have approximately 90 drawings of the 365 drawings. We couldn't get everyone printed and shown to you. I think later on you will see all the drawings on our website, but there's some of them, so go in and have a pleasant afternoon for that. Thank you, everybody.
Well, I could have gone for 500 more.
Yeah, we know that.
I was like,
I could feel that. No, but really.
No, but that's why I wanted to end with a kind of humorous note, because I think that's also
Yeah, but you around so many important topics and drawing.